Basketball has always been a game of 5-on-5, but some of the sport's most iconic moments happen when everything slows down and it just becomes a game of one-on-one. It's in these moments where stars often prove what they're truly made of and where champions separate themselves from the pack. More than anything though, this is when basketball is in its purest form. It takes the 5-on-5 game and turns it into a chess match, with both players reading each other in real time and countering in their own unique way. How is it though that in a sport with 10 players on the court and so much happening, a game of one-on-one can be the single biggest variable? Isolations have been a staple for NBA offenses since the very beginning. As early as 1955, Bob Pettit pioneered the face-up game. Because he was a threat to shoot, when he faced the basket, defenders had to play the jumper, which he paired with a good first step to attack the paint in no more than 1 or 2 dribbles. A few years later, we'd see perimeter players like Elgin Baylor and Jerry West pick up on these concepts, but with a little more juice as they added ball handling and passing, which helped lead the Lakers to a decade of elite offenses. Of course, the 60s and 70s were dominated by a different type of isolation, the post-up. Dribbling rules hadn't yet evolved to allow players to do much with their handle, so by turning a back to the basket, that's where you'd see guys win with their size, leverage, and creativity. When you think of the post-up, your mind probably goes to brute force and overpowering defenders. But back then, the league was pretty strict about not letting offensive players initiate contact, so the giants of the game had to create with finesse. Wilt Chamberlain dominated with the turnaround jumper. Kareem had such good touch, footwork, and balance that he might still be the single most effective one-on-one scorer we've ever seen. Over the years, refs became a bit more relaxed with the way they let offensive players use their bodies, and that's when we saw a rise in the physicality of one-on-one play, with post players backing their defenders down with force and developing power moves. That's not to say there wasn't still a place for finesse bigs though. Actually, one of the most revolutionary offenses in NBA history was built around the big with the most finesse of all. Midway through the 1992 season, the Rockets fired head coach Don Chaney and brought in Rudy Tomjanovich, who viewed the game of basketball through a futuristic lens. He had a simple idea that would change basketball forever. What if he surrounded the game's best post scorer, Hakeem Olajuwon, with as much shooting as possible? This marked the birth of the 4-out, 1-in offense that we still see teams use to this day, running almost everything through Hakeem in the post and dotting the three-point line with weapons. Remember, this is when illegal defense was still around, so opponents were forced to make impossible decisions. They could leave Hakeem in single coverage and get dream shaken into oblivion, or they could commit to a double, leaving a shooter open on the perimeter. Pick your poison. When the NBA shortened the three-point line in 1995, more teams started to lean into similar strategies. The Jazz often went to 4-out, 1-in setups when running through Karl Malone. Except he didn't play the 5, so they notoriously put their non-shooting bigs on the perimeter as a way to cheat the system. Because of illegal defense, defenders couldn't roam away from these bigs, even if they weren't a threat to score. The most success this style of offense would ever see though came from the Lakers at the turn of the century. They had the ultimate weapon, a 7'1", 325-pound physical anomaly who was a mismatch for literally every human on Earth. It wasn't possible to guard him without collapsing everyone, and those shooters helped produce some of the best playoff offenses in NBA history. This period of time was transitional for a number of reasons though, not just the added physicality and the rise of the three-point shot. In addition to refs becoming more relaxed with physicality, they started to allow a lot more freedom with the dribble. It was during these years that we saw the birth of the modern crossover as well as the hanging hesitation dribble. Along with Michael Jordan coming in and completely transforming the dynamic of the sport, we saw a rise in isolation usage from guards who could play from the perimeter with a live dribble and work their way downhill. Allen Iverson, Dwayne Wade, eventually Kyrie Irving. That didn't mean the traditional face-up or mid-post game was dead though. Not only was that also a big part of MJ's arsenal, the 2000s were dominated with players like Kobe Bryant, Carmelo Anthony, and Dirk Nowitzki who loved to play from 15 feet in and could operate in a phone booth. We're still seeing the lasting effects of that era from veterans in the game today like Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard, and DeMar DeRozan. The reason you don't see perimeter players come into the league with that as a big part of their game anymore is because of what happened in 2017. Everything, and I mean everything, changed when Mike D'Antoni arrived in Houston. He essentially created an entirely new offensive structure, pulling ideas from each of the great isolation offenses before him. What if you could use screens to seek out a specific matchup to go up against? What if you could space the floor like the 90s Rockets, surrounding one guy with as much shooting as possible? But what if instead of post-ups, that one guy was a live dribble perimeter isolationist? The exploration of these questions would go on to change the NBA forever. Here's a look at how every team performed on perimeter isolations during D'Antoni's 4-year run with the Rockets, pass outs included. From left to right is total possessions, and top to bottom is how efficient they were. Of course, Houston was a complete outlier, isolating nearly twice as much as any other team. But the craziest part is that James Harden alone cleared second place by about 700 possessions while producing absurd efficiency. To highlight just how efficient we're talking, here's a look at every team's overall half-court scoring efficiency during that run relative to how much they isolated. The Rockets just eclipsed the Warriors for number 1 because of the lackluster 2020 season, but there wasn't a single team to sustain 1 point per possession, and there's basically no correlation between the isolation volume and overall efficiency because it's rare for a single player to drive the results that much from one play type. James Harden was pretty rare, the definition of a one-man offense. Harden and the Rockets laid the foundation for what a modern-day ISO looks like. You've still got those mid-post wings, you've still got the face-up game, you've still got the low-post physical forces, but the most prominent form of one-on-one offense is finding a matchup you like, operating from the perimeter with a spread floor, and looking to create downhill. Just take a look at how the last 2 NBA champions ran their offense. Although isolations have gone through so many different transformations from where they happen on the court to how they're defended and how they're refereed, they've remained just as, if not more important to NBA offenses than they were 70 years ago. So what is it that makes the one-on-one aspect so valuable in a 5-on-5 sport, and just how important is it to be one of the best isolation players in the league? It sort of goes without saying, but everything starts with the effectiveness of a player going to work one-on-one. Everyone's got different sweet spots, but whether it's an early perimeter isolation, a post-up, or anything in between, great one-on-one players can generate above-average efficiency on these plays consistently. As things currently stand, the league average half-court possession is worth about 0.98 points, meaning anyone who can isolate and score more efficiently than that marker is actively producing above-average team offense. Since the start of last season, 42 players have attempted to score on at least 250 isolations, post-ups included. And if we set that 0.98 marker, it's pretty split between above and below average efficiency. The least productive guys have been Franz Wagner, Bam, and Westbrook. They isolate a ton, often to the detriment of their team's offense. As we get closer to that threshold, you'll see Paolo, Ant, Şengün, and right around average is where you'll find Cade, Giannis, and LeBron. From this point on, we're talking about transformative isolation scorers. Tatum, Brunson, Durant, a post-prime Harden, and the 3 current kings of one-on-one play, the league's premier MVP candidates. As players get more and more efficient on these plays, that's where you start to see defenses ask those unanswerable questions. Do you play them in single coverage? Send a double? Load up in the gaps? Pre-rotate? And this is where the very best isolation players separate themselves from the rest of the pack. Because it isn't just the scoring that makes a player elite one-on-one, it's how they react to the other 4 defenders. Either they have such a dominant scoring game or wide array of counters that they can still get to their own shot at will even while seeing aggressive coverages, or they're a good enough passer to pick apart defenses that show too much attention to their scoring, helping their teammates get higher quality looks. One thing holds true in both situations. The best of the best see these coverages, read and react, counter everything, and make defenses pick their poison. Only a select few can do this at the highest level, especially against championship caliber defenses in the playoffs. But those select few almost make it too easy for coaches to build an elite offensive system. If a player can create high efficiency shots on demand, take care of the ball, and counter different coverages by making the right reads, it can be as simple as spreading the floor and enabling them to do exactly that. Then what starts to happen is that these elite isolationists reach a certain threshold in terms of volume that causes opposing defenses to use abnormal coverages by default. From there, the value they have on their team's offense just grows exponentially because they're walking up the court with an inherent advantage. Maybe the most extreme example of this came from the Jazz in the 2019 playoffs. They were so worried about Harden's step back that his defender would actually guard him from behind. Obviously, they couldn't just let him run into the paint, so the next step in this coverage was to essentially use Rudy Gobert as a QB spy, parking at the rim and ignoring everything but the ball. Harden's isolation scoring was such a problem that they'd rather let him take a free lane to the paint than look for his own shot from the perimeter. This meant Utah's backline was compromised at all times. Sure, they limited Harden's scoring, but it came at the sacrifice of dunks and corner threes for his teammates, and the Rockets didn't have much trouble taking care of business in 5 games. A more recent example of an extreme coverage like this came from the Nuggets in round 2 of last year. They know that Shea wants to do his damage in the middle of the floor, so their set defense essentially became a zone. They got into a shell, boxed off the paint, parked Jokic in the lane, and tried to keep Shea as far away from the basket as possible. With how aggressively they played the gaps though, all it took was basic passes to create long closeouts. And although OKC went cold from 3, they were able to take advantage of those situations by driving off the catch. Along with Shea's own individual shot making, just going over the top of the zone, they were able to break this shell down and escape a 7-game series. A consistent theme you'll see with these supreme isolation talents is that because they don't rely on anyone else to get them open, they allow lesser talent to exist on the court. Don't get me wrong, OKC's supporting cast was phenomenal, but about 90% of that help came on defense. When things got tight and shots stopped falling, they could keep 3 or 4 all defensive level guys on the court, knowing that Shea's individual scoring would raise the floor just enough for them to sneak away with wins. While you can't really quantify the value of having that sort of release valve, I don't think it's a coincidence that these are often the guys who end up stacking rings. While every championship team is built differently, one theme you'll find across every era is that they had an outlet for if their first punch got taken away. Every now and then, you'll even see a team go into a series with an inverted defensive strategy, preferring the great isolation scorer to operate one-on-one because the alternative is that much tougher to defend. Take the Prime Warriors, for example. Between their shooting talent, constant movement, screening, and high-level passing, nobody could figure them out. But the team that came closest was the 2018 Rockets. In an effort to avoid those breakdowns that lead to layups or open threes, they switched literally everything for the entire series, and it slowed the motion offense to a halt. The downside of switching though is that you're letting the offense handpick their matchups. So in key moments they abandoned the motion, turned to Kevin Durant as their new primary source of offense, and he rose to the occasion. All that's to say, the value of isolation scoring isn't always about who can put the ball in the basket more efficiently. The difference between a point per possession and 1.1 points per possession sounds massive over an entire season, but that's not how defenses respond. Once you reach a certain threshold as an isolation scorer, defenses are going to be forced to react. Then the real value comes from how you approach those coverages, hit different pressure points, and make it as easy as possible for the entire team to score. What made the Rockets so impossible to cover in the mid-90s wasn't just Hakeem scoring. The fact that he could give you an efficient 30 on any given night laid the foundation, but it was the way he leveraged that with Houston shooting that made them what they were. The same applies to Shaq's Lakers, Harden's Rockets, or more recently Tatum's Celtics. Historically, teams with this caliber of isolation creator have an absurdly high offensive floor. But exactly how valuable is it to have one of the best isolation creators in the league on your team? Thanks to Synergy's tracking, we actually have the numbers for every isolation and post-up going back to 2005. And since then, 191 players have averaged at least 10 of those possessions a game, pass-outs included. 164 of them produced above average half-court efficiency on those plays. To give you an example for what I mean by that, earlier I mentioned that the league average half-court offense is producing 0.98 points per possession. So if someone scored 1 point per isolation, over the course of 100 possessions, they'd be about 2 points better than average. So since 2005, about 86% of these volume isolation players produced an efficiency on those plays that was better than the league's average from that season. To me, that makes complete sense because it wouldn't be very smart for a team to build their entire offense around an inefficient isolation game. And that's where you'll find the difference between players isolating out of necessity or out of luxury. For a better depiction of what I'm talking about, here's a look at these 191 players, both in terms of their own efficiency and how good the team's offense was when they were on the court. It's not a perfect correlation, but there's a clear signal that as these isolation players become more and more efficient, the team's offense does the same. What really stands out to me though, is that once these players reach a certain caliber, they're so productive that it's almost impossible for the team's offense to struggle while they're on the court. Take a guy like Kobe Bryant, for example. From 2005 to 2007, he played on weaker rosters, but he produced some of the greatest ISO seasons ever, so the Lakers still had a great offense during his minutes. As the team around him got better, he remained every bit as effective one-on-one, and the back end of his prime was spent playing for some of the best offenses in the league. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, but it's worth noting that of these few outliers, all of them played on teams that either had remarkably weak rosters or geared their entire lineup towards defensive talent. That takes me back to what I said earlier about how these isolation creators allow lesser offensive talent to exist on the court. They also bolster secondary offensive talent by creating advantages for them to play off of or opportunities to finish plays. So not only are they actively boosting their team's offensive efficiency through their own offensive production, they're helping the other 4 guys do the same while allowing their teams to roll out better defensive lineups, meaning that the overall signal is overwhelming success. 21 seasons have started and finished since 2004. In 19 of those years, the finals matchup consisted of a player isolating at least 10 times a game. Of course, guys guys like Kobe and LeBron skew the numbers a bit, but we've also seen plenty of dominant post-up guys produce finals runs like Tim Duncan, Dwight Howard, Dirk Nowitzki, and Nikola Jokic. Out of all 21 seasons, 14 of the NBA champions had one of these guys. The other 7 were some of the game's dominant team runs like the 08 Celtics, 14 Spurs, 19 Raptors, and all 4 of Golden State's runs. It's worth noting that each of these teams still had a big isolation presence even if it wasn't happening 10 times a game. In 2008, both Garnett and Pierce were among the most efficient one-on-one creators in the league. The same applied to Duncan in 2014, Kawhi in 2019, and either Steph or KD for all 4 of those runs. In simpler terms, there's a clear signal that having an elite isolation player puts you in a position to win a championship. With that in mind, who are some of the best isolation players we've seen during the last 2 decades? If we keep the focus on those guys isolating at least 10 times a game, the most efficient season belongs to 2014 LeBron, who scored almost 22 points ahead of league average. He's followed closely by the best of Jokic, Durant, Kobe, and Harden. Speaking of which, the Beard owns both of the highest volume seasons, giving him arguably the best 3-year run of the century. Across a longer span of 5 to 7 years though, the 2 most prolific names that keep showing up are Kobe and Dirk. I don't think it's a coincidence that they consistently led their teams to contention. An even more interesting and relevant combo though is which players fit the bill in today's game. Here's a look at every player who's isolated at least 200 times this season. On the lower end of the efficiency spectrum, you'll find burgeoning young stars like Maxey, Avdia, Wemby, Ant, and Paolo. This could be the next step in their developments. On the higher end, a few guys stick out as being incredibly efficient while falling below 10 isolations a game. So one can make the argument that Cade, Brown, and Randall are capable of running an offense through these actions. However, you'll notice that 5 guys separate themselves from the rest of the pack. The kings of one-on-one play. And it should come as no surprise that those names are Harden, Shea, Giannis, Luka, and Jokic. But what might come as a surprise is just what caliber of creator these guys are historically. Both Jokic and Luka are currently breaking LeBron's record for the most efficient season since 2005. Giannis is up there with the best of the best, while Harden and Shea both land in the top 25 in efficiency themselves. From modern stars to guys like Kobe and Dirk, we've seen some of NBA history's greatest isolation players over the last 25 years. But just because the numbers don't go back any further, doesn't mean there weren't even better one-on-one players before them. Was the best isolation player ever peak Shaq, Michael Jordan in his prime, Olajuwon in a futuristic offense, Kareem in the 70s? It's almost impossible to definitively say who the greatest isolation player ever was. But one thing is certain. Whether it's 1955 or 2026, a shifty guard or a physically dominant big, the ability to break down a defense one-on-one has always been basketball's most valuable skill.